Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today we're pleased to speak once again to Dr. Safaruk Chowdhury. How are you, Akhi Saf?
Assalamu alaikum. I'm well, alhamdulillah. Hope you're well.
Yep, okay. Saf studied philosophy at King's College London and completed it with the accompanying Associate of King's College award. He then traveled to Cairo, studying the traditional Islamic studies curricula at Al-Azhar University. He returned to the UK to complete his master's at SOAS University with distinction. Saf's most recent book is entitled Islamic Theology and the Problem of Evil, published by AUC Press, which is the first work in Islamic studies to treat the topic within the analytic theology approach. Saf is currently lead researcher on the project Beyond Foundationalism, New Horizons in Muslim Analytic Theology, which is funded under a John Templeton Foundation Grant Award in association with Cambridge Muslim College and Aziz Foundation. Saf runs the website IslamicAnalyticTheology.org on the senior editorial board of the Journal of Islamic Philosophy, and his academic work can be found on his academia page. And these links, inshallah, will be provided in the description box below. We are recording this session on January 21st, 2024, while the cruel and unjust oppression unleashed against our brothers and sisters in Palestine remains ongoing. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep our Palestinian brothers and sisters safe and firm upon Iman. And we also ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept those killed as martyrs and to keep their loved ones patient. Ameen.
Ameen. Ameen. Ya Rabbil
Alamin. When it comes to actual positive arguments against God's existence, we're accustomed to hearing the argument from the problem of evil. So, how can an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good God permit evil in the world? Likewise, there are other arguments out there that seek to question God's existence by questioning the coherence of his attributes. So, for example, if God is all-powerful, can he create a rock that he can't carry? Or if God is all-powerful and all-truthful, then does he have the power to lie? Or if God is all-knowing and knows the future, is he powerful and free enough to change the future? These sorts of paradoxes have been put forth to try to suggest that the idea of a qualitatively infinite God is incoherent. So even if it does not aim to disprove God's existence altogether, it certainly aims to disprove the common theistic conception of an infinitely perfect God. So how do we address these sorts of arguments? Inshallah, Brother Saf will enlighten us on that question today. Akhi Saf, whenever you're ready, the floor is all yours.
شكرا أخي. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وبعد. As you mentioned with your dua in the beginning, we try and resume our daily lives with a heavy heart, and we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal liberates Palestine from this tyranny and oppression at the moment. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. The issue of the matter that you raised, the theological matter, this is the issue to do with sort of paradox. So let me sort of sketch what I want to go through today, hopefully for our viewers and listeners. And inshallah, I hope by the end of it, the matter can be simplified and then hopefully remedied, any confusion remedied, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So the overview of sort of the presentation that I want to give is, first of all, what a paradox is in this case. In general, what a paradox is. Then what a paradox is about divine God. Then we're going to look at, I think I want to present on 3 paradoxes. So paradox of omnipotence, paradox related to divine power, paradox of omniscience, paradox is related to divine knowledge, and something referred to as omnipotence impeccability paradox. And I'll be referring it to as the problem of fit. And that is, how do we reconcile two attributes of the divine when it comes to some particular matter? And I'll go through an example that is well discussed in the Islamic tradition. Then I want to give my concluding remarks. These are just my personal reflections on the whole topic of divine attributes and paradox. Many may agree, many may disagree, and many, of course, will have their own views on it. But I want to share my own concluding remarks about it. Maybe we can discuss that as well. And maybe if you feel free to sort of jump in with anything that you have, any of your views as well, that'd be great to discuss. So the first thing is, what are paradoxes? Now, here's a quote from, many will know, from Quine, W.V.O. Quine. A paradox is just any conclusion that at first sounds absurd, but that has an argument to sustain it. Now, paradoxes are often stated to be sort of kind of contradictory realities or apparently contradictory realities. So they can be in the form of something, a paradoxical thing, or a paradoxical statement. So the word paradox often is paired with or synonymous with contradiction, although philosophers and theologians want to keep the two terms separate. But to try and be more precise, a paradox involves some kind of contradictory or absurd conclusion, but it seems to be arrived at via some kind of compelling reasoning. So the reasoning looks good, but the conclusion, you scratch your head, you think the conclusion can't be right. But yet what preceded it, the reasoning, the thinking behind it, is okay. So we want to resist the conclusion, but we want to embrace the reasoning because the reasoning seems okay, but we want to resist the conclusion. So the kind of trick is to pinpoint exactly where the flaw in the reasoning is. So that might take some training, that might take a specialist to pinpoint where exactly the reasoning is, the flaw is in the reasoning. And this reminds me a bit of like ilal al-hadith, actually. When I was studying paradoxes first, I thought, you got to be a specialist to pick out ilal in hadith. And very, very few of the muhaddithun had expertise in ilal. So even the passed over sort of great scholars, right? Imam ad-Daraqutni was one of the masters of ilal. So these kind of defects and flaws that unless a specialist eye can...
Just to clarify to the listener, so science of ilal would be detecting like hidden defects in the chain of transmission. Yeah, exactly,
in hadith, that's right. And anyone of our viewers and listeners who are familiar with the science of hadith would know that this is a very rarefied area of hadith. So it's a bit like paradoxes are a bit like that. Maybe not as rarefied, but it needs someone to pinpoint the flaw in the reasoning, even though it may not seem apparent. So I guess the paradoxes for me are a bit like magic tricks. You get mesmerized by the person who's doing the trick, right? And you're like, wow. For a moment, you kind of think, you're convinced by the trick, but then when you stop that this is an illusion and it's a kind of contrived and elaborate act to make something appear other than what it is. And we know that because you got, masked magicians who sort of unpack the reality behind tricks. So similarly, I see paradoxes like that. I see paradoxes as these kind of tricks in reasoning that seem so compelling, but yet the conclusion is odd. But nevertheless, having said that, many people are riveted by paradoxes, especially in theological paradoxes. Many are, they find it sort of appealing, attractive. They like these kind of sort of paradoxical sort of examples. But I think on a serious note, for some people, paradoxes become a point of confusion, especially in Iman. And I will say something about this, in my concluding remark. I personally think there isn't really anything that that one ought to worry about when it comes to paradoxes once one pinpoints the flaw in the reasoning. So, yeah, so this isn't roughly what a paradox is. Yeah. So, on to our sort of theological paradoxes, and as I mentioned, now many people who study theology or philosophy, maybe if they've done it at GCSE, if you're in the UK and you study sort of, your GCSE exams, or your A-level exams, if you take religious studies, you will study things like, these paradoxes as part of the curriculum. Now, when it comes to theological paradoxes that relate to the divine within theology, the point is the paradoxes are the aim behind the paradoxes are to highlight some core tension in the believer's conception of this ultimate being or reality. And you sort of set that up at the beginning. So paradoxes are supposed to alert the believer to some kind of tension in their conception or idea of the divine. Or, in a more pernicious sort of aim, paradoxes are set up to lead the believer, or mislead the believer, if we could put it like that, to accept absurd or contradictory conclusions about the nature, attributes, or acts of God. That's the kind of pernicious aim behind paradoxes. Now, it might be worth mentioning, before I mention examples of the paradox, if you look at the literature, when you raise tensions or contradictions about the divine, about God, there are kind of three types of contradictions that sort of philosophers present or lay out. One, there is a type 1 contradiction or type 1 tension. If no one likes the word contradiction, let's leave it. We can use the word tension. It's not a problem. But in the literature, they're referred to as contradiction. You've got type 1 contradictions. This is where an issue arises in a single attribute of God, like knowledge, power, goodness. The nature of that attribute or the coherence of that attribute is somehow sort of challenged. This is a kind of type 1 contradiction or tension. A type 2 contradiction is between two or more attributes of the divine. So let's say divine will and power, or divine impeccability, i.e. moral perfection, and divine power. That's what we'll be looking at later on. That's the type 2 contradiction. Do the two attributes, are they consistent with each other? And can we hold both in the full sense? And then you've got type 3 contradiction, and you alluded to an example at the beginning being the problem of evil. A type 3 contradiction or a type 3 tension is between a particular attribute of the divine or attributes and our experience of the world. So, for example, divine goodness and wisdom and suffering in the world. So we experience suffering in the world. That's not a fiction. That's not an illusion. It's real. How do we understand our experience of the world when the divine mentions something about themselves? So the divine says he's all merciful, compassionate, loving, wise, yet what we experience seems to sort of create some tension with that. That's a type 3 contradiction.
Yeah. So a type 2.
Yeah.
So a type 2 contradiction will be a contradiction within the essence of God between two or more attributes. Well, type 3 would be a contradiction between one of God's attributes and something that exists externally to God's
in the world. Yeah. So between an attribute of God and creation, and so whatever we experience in creation, how do we make the two congruent? Because in our minds, our finite minds, we seem to generate an incongruency between the two. So those are the kind of 3 sort of broad types of contradictions or tensions.
And do these types have names? I presume that
I,
they're not called type 1, type 2 in the literature. So,
I'll be honest, I haven't seen specific labels that are
hmm,
accepted in the literature.
uh-huh,
Yeah.
uh-huh.
Well, I call it type one, type two, type three.
Okay.
And if anyone can come up with fancy names, that would be great.
Hmm.
And then maybe that will catch on, and then we can adopt them. So yeah, for lack of having names for these sort of tensions or contradictions, I've just referred to them as type one, type two, type three. So when we look at now, for example, the omnipotence paradox, which I'll explain, that is a type one tension or type one contradiction because it's about one attribute of the divine. So a single attribute. So in this case, we're looking at divine power. And the paradox is supposed to highlight some kind of difficulty or tension in the sort of coherency of that attribute. So let me go on to then mention what it is, and we'll look at some sort of solutions. Now, what I want to say is what I will be presenting here today, for those who are familiar with Islamic theology and, in fact, philosophy, the tradition, I'm not bringing anything novel. Ulama in our tradition, across the board, across the board, have discussed these issues at length and given robust solutions. And I'm just sort of copy pasting those solutions and bringing it here in the presentation. So there's not anything novel that I'm presenting. I just want to make that clear. This is not a hold your breath moment. Uh, and the details, if should anyone want to follow up on the material here in the presentation, can find it in the link in the handout, I think. So the details are in there. And if that's beneficial,
Yeah, Jazakallah khair.
I hope
We'll,
it is.
we'll definitely link to that in the description box.
Inshallah, inshallah. Okay, so what is this paradox of the stone? Again, my aim is to sort of just simplify it. Wallahi, I'll tell you one thing, Akhi. I often find people like jumping in the deep end. I'm the opposite. And I'm not saying this is a virtue or trying to blow my own trumpet. I like to sort of dip my toe in first, do the alphabet, basic stuff first, and then try and go on to things that are um, more difficult. If I find I've understood it at a simpler level, I don't really feel the need, me necessarily, to then confuse my own understanding and go deeper. That's just me. That's just me. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to simplify it to get to the kernel of the issue. So what is the paradox of the stone? So an omnipotence paradox is a paradox that creates a tension in one attribute of God, and that is God's power. And an example that's often brought and gleefully by those who like this kind of stuff and object to the belief in God is the paradox of the stone. And it goes something like this. Many people have written in different ways. Here's one way that I've put it. So Allah Azza wa Jal is Al-Qadir. He's omnipotent. He's all powerful. He's absolutely powerful, which means he can do anything generally defined as anything that is logically possible to do. Creating a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted is something logically possible. I mean, just in and of itself, creating a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted is something logically possible. Therefore, Allah, as being omnipotent, ought to be able to create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted. Okay, but if Allah does create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted, then he cannot lift it. But if he cannot lift that stone, then there is something he cannot do, which means he's not omnipotent. Thus, if Allah is omnipotent, then Allah is not omnipotent. So we've affirmed and denied the attribute. But any attribute that implies it's contradictory, i.e. having the thing and then not having the thing at the same time, that's muhal, it's impossible. Thus, the very notion of Allah being omnipotent is logically contradictory and impossible. Now, I say when I use language like this, wallahi, we're talking about Allah Azza wa Jal, so I want to be careful in how I use the language. So it's coming off disrespectful. It's just the way the example has been set up. And I ask Allah, to forgive me for using this kind of deficient language regarding Him Jalla wa Ala. But just to set up the example, this is the crux of it. So we can't have Allah being powerful, all powerful, and not all powerful at the same time, that's contradictory. So we know that a contradiction is impossible.
Mm.
So that's the crux of the problem. If he's all powerful, then he ought to be able to create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it. But if he, but if he is, but if he goes on and creates a stone so heavy that he can't lift it, then he's not all powerful because it's something they can't do, namely lift it. If he can't lift it, then there's something that he cannot do, and therefore, he lacks power, so he can't be omnipotent. So this is the kind of sort of setup of the problem. This is supposed to put tension on or create a problem regarding the attribute of divine power. Now let's have a look at it. Because on the face of it, you think, okay, actually, that's true. Something's logically possible. It's within the divine power to do it. But then if God does it, then he's just shown that he can't do something. So he both can and can't do something. That's contradictory. So we've got a paradox now. Let's have a look. I think what's going on, there's lots of ways to gloss this, and many theologians and philosophers have glossed it in different ways. I think there's actually two different arguments going on here that have been lumped together. And it's this. See, I've labeled them argument one, argument two. So if the divine is omnipotent, then he can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted, an unliftable stone. That's premise one. Premise two, if the divine can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted, then he's not omnipotent. Allah is both, then the divine is both omnipotent and not omnipotent. That's a contradiction. Therefore, he's not omnipotent. The second argument goes like this. If God is omnipotent, then he can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted. If God can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted, then he is not omnipotent. God can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted. Therefore, he is not omnipotent. Okay. I think this is what's going on in the argument. I've highlighted the problematic premises in red. The issue is this. Argument one is deductively valid. You can derive the conclusion that God is not omnipotent from the premises. But the problem is, premise number two is unsound. Premise two is wrong, which makes the argument unsound. If God can create a stone so heavy it cannot be lifted, then he's not omnipotent. That premise is false. To make argument number one valid, you need a premise that is in argument number two. And what's that premise? Number 7. God can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted. But that premise is false. So you've got a conflation of two different arguments, each with mistaken and problematic premises. And so the argument in effect is saying, in order for the argument to be valid, you have to affirm that God can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted. That implies that you have to negate the very thing you need for the argument to take off. Can you see? You have to affirm the divine, the power, in order for the example to take off. But what you're doing though with the example is that you're cutting the branch, the very branch you're sitting on. So it almost becomes, you're crashing the plane before you take off. But you need the plane to take off in order for the example to even get going. So it's like that. So let me formalize it, then people can see where the problem is taking place. So, argument number one says, if God is omnipotent, premise one, God is omnipotent, then he is able to create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted. Then premise two says, it is possible for God to create a stone so heavy that if it is possible for God to create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted, then he is not all powerful. Can't have that. That's false. We need God to be powerful in order for the example to work. If God is all powerful, then he's not all powerful. That's a contradiction. And we can derive the conclusion, therefore he's not. From 3, we can derive 4, he's not all powerful. But the problem is in premise 2. What argument 1 needs is proposition number 7, that God can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted. We need to take that 7 and put it into 2. Can you see? But we can't do that because that premise is false. So we're taking a false premise and putting it into an argument to make it valid, which it won't make it valid, make it invalid. So this is a confusion. You're pulling one thing you need from another argument to put in your first argument, but you cannot have both together. And that's the point. We cannot have God being denied omnipotence, but needed at the same time for the example to take off. And this is the problem with the omnipotence paradox. It becomes an issue of, I negate the very thing that I need in the first place. But I cannot get it from the argument itself. I need some other assumption. So as I put here, although the first argument is deductively valid, it is not sound because the second premise is false. The true premise can be found in argument number 2, but that premise is invalid. The fact that God can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted. So we cannot make the inferences we want from the argument we can't make the logical inferences we want from the argument because the argument premises are not correct. You see, so I'm seeing 2 arguments trying to be played together in this omnipotence paradox. One argument needs the premises of the other, but you cannot have both arguments. That's essentially what's going on.
And wouldn't the person putting forth this criticism, what if they were to retort by saying, look, Saf, I'm not saying that, premise number 7 is true. All I'm really trying to say is that, that must be the case if premise 1 is true. Right, because that is what my understanding of omnipotence entails, right? So I think that what the person's trying to argue here is that if we understand omnipotence, unless you're willing to challenge my understanding of omnipotence, I understand omnipotence to suggest that God should be able to do everything that is logically possible, and therefore the reason why I've put forth premise 7 is because I feel that must be the case in light of affirming omnipotence.
So what we have to say then is that if someone believes that what they're saying, if they're saying God can create a stone so heavy he cannot be lifted, what they're in effect saying is God has power and not power at the same time. That's what they're saying. They're saying he's so powerful that he can't do something. Can you see? So if God creates a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted, then what they're saying is they're affirming that God can do the impossible. That is, he can make something that is an object of his power that proves that he's not powerful.
Yeah.
That's in essence what the person is saying. Can you see?
Yeah, but isn't the intention of the person putting forth this argument to show that omnipotence is a logic, is an impossible attribute for any being to have? I think the person putting this argument would say, "Soft, precisely. Yeah, well, it doesn't make sense. That's the whole point I'm trying to make."
No, the issue is this: what you're trying to impute to God is something that is not properly in the bounds of something that is possible to do. What you're saying for God to do is to undo God's power. That's what you're saying he has to do. So then we've got to go to the definition of omnipotence. So the omnipotence here assumes, remember, what is logically possible to do. Now, is it logically possible for God to do something that will undermine his very power? That is where the crux of the problem is getting to. Can you see?
Mhm.
So a stone that God cannot lift, a stone that God cannot lift, um, would imply, would have to say, would imply that there is an object such that has such a mass or has such a reality that is beyond the control of the very person who created that very. A finite object is such that is beyond the power of God to be able to control. That's what we're saying. You see, now we're getting into the realms of, what we're saying is something that's by accepting that, we're accepting that God is not perfect. God is absolutely deficient. And if that's the case, then he's not worthy of total worship. So what we have to do then is explain, what do we mean by omnipotence? Omnipotence is not the power. Most Muslim theologians have said to be able to do the absurd, i.e., to do the very thing that undermines you. Rather, what is within the bounds of what is possible and not the absurd. It's absurd to say God to create something. God has the power to create something that then shows he doesn't have power. Can you see?
Yeah. Yeah.
That is absurd. So that is not within the realms or scope of divine power. The absurdity doesn't fall into the realm of divine power. So it doesn't become a thing in the first place.
Mhm.
How can I
Yeah.
put
Yeah.
it?
So when the
It doesn't
Quran,
become,
when the
I mean,
Quran
we put it
says that
into
Allah has
words,
power over all things,
yeah, but it's
that
not a thing
this
in
is
the
not a
sense,
thing, right? Yeah.
yeah. Even though we put words together in a way that we can understand, there's
Mm.
no reality behind the
There's no
words.
reality behind it.
That's what the ulama was saying when it doesn't fall under a maqdurat. It doesn't
Yeah.
fall under one of the proper objects of divine power. It's not a
Mhm.
thing that divine power connects to. So we can use these words, but it wouldn't. It's
Yeah. There's no
the
reality to
language
it.
allows it. Yeah, the language allows it, but it's not a thing that has a reality.
Hmm.
And this is the issue. So if a person presses, well, then he can't. He's not omnipotent because he can't do it. Well, is it a doable thing in the first place? Once we say that it's not, because it leads to absurdities, because it means accepting an absurdity, then an absurdity cannot be a category, a proper category of an object of divine power. Essentially, that's what it is. Now, if
I,
someone wants to say, yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. I know I know you don't plan to talk about this today, but just another quick analogy, right?
yeah,
So, can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can he terminate his existence? Right? And at the same time, it depends, like, how are you understanding Allah's nature and his attributes? If God is a necessary being, and by definition, the question becomes invalid as to whether, to even ask whether he can terminate
yeah,
his own existence.
yeah, what you're saying in effect is, you know, can a being who is necessary,
Not be necessary.
absolutely independent, absolutely uncaused, infinite, perfect being who necessarily exists, not exist at one point in time? That's what you're saying. If the divine were to, you know, let's say
Yeah,
self-terminate,
look, to simplify what you just said. Can a necessary being
not be necessary.
be unnecessary? Be
Yeah,
contingent?
that's what I'm saying.
That
Now,
that's the thing. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
that's the expression. Now you put it in a sentence,
It makes
which
sense.
is, yeah, which is you've enunciated it, but
Yeah, yeah.
that's not a reality because what we're saying is,
Actually, no, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, yeah. You could enunciate it. You could express what you were
yeah,
trying to say. You have the words to say it, but there's actually no meaning behind it.
yeah. So that's why the ulama, and we'll come to look at this as further on down the line. The ulama have stated that one of the constraints on the divine power, the scope of divine power, qudra, does not include his own essence.
Yeah, yeah.
So when Allah says, "Huwa qadir ala kulli shay," here, what must be excluded rationally is Allah's own attributes and his essence.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
doesn't create his own attributes, he doesn't create his own essence. Because then it wouldn't make sense to say, here is the uncaused cause who necessarily exists, but who's also contingently exists and has a cause.
Hmm.
Can you see? That becomes so that the omnipotence paradox is like that. You're entailing you're saying that that the divine can do the thing that is not doable, is not a thing to do in the first place for his power to properly connect to. So anyway, so that for me, if you look at the logic, the logic is invalid, even though the argument might so the argument A1 is valid, but it's not sound.
Yes.
Because premise number 2 is not correct,
Mm-hmm.
i.e. the premise that if God can create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted, then he's not omnipotent. We can't accept that he's not omnipotent. We can't accept that premise. So it looks deductively valid, which it is, but the premise 2 is unsound. To make the argument valid, you need a valid premise. And that premise is Allah creates a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted. But that's false. He doesn't create a stone so heavy that it cannot be lifted, because it's not a doable thing in the first place. You can see?
Yes.
So you need the premise to make your argument valid, but the premise that you're going to then borrow is invalid. So you can't get your valid argument, your sound argument, sorry. You might get a deductively valid one, but you won't get a sound one.
I just to clarify again to our listeners, this distinction between valid and sound.
Oh, yeah.
You say valid just simply means that the argument flows properly, meaning that if each of the premises were correct, the argument would flow smoothly and accurately. But the problem is with the actual premises themselves, which is that not all of them are actually correct.
Which makes the argument unsound.
Which makes the argument at the end of the day unsound. Yeah.
So you can't accept it. So that's sort of some of the general. That's one of the general things I wanted to point out for the reader. If they look at the logic behind, because the logical flaw has to be pointed out. What's the flaw in the logic? Otherwise, we could be misled by the natural language. So this is where the steps in the inference become very, very important. So it's logically nothing to worry about, in my opinion. And plus, even if someone didn't want to go down and look at the logic because they're a bit afraid of it, the concept itself is trying to say a thing that is absurd or doesn't make sense. Can God do it? Yeah. That's essentially, if we were to put it in very simple words, can a thing that is not a thing be a thing?
Yeah, exactly.
But it can't. Doesn't matter how many words we use to try and make it a thing, it's not a thing, a proper thing that falls under the object of divine power. And so that's essentially where the paradox really dissolves. It doesn't become a worry anymore. You're asking me to accept that God do the absurd. Now, some people might want to accept that and make God do the absurd. But the ulama didn't want to go down that route because of the reason that you mentioned. It opens the gate for all sorts of absurdities, like the divine acting contrary to their nature, which is just impossible. That can't be right. Then he wouldn't be the very being that he is.
I think a number of fideists, fall into some of these absurd stances. I'm not sure. I think it was Kierkegaard, someone who adopted one of these. I forgot. But,
it's possible. Kierkegaard. I'm not sure.
I thought he was a fideist, but that's fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was. Look, these examples are endless, by the way. These examples are endless. Like, can God create something that is also no thing at the same time? Like, you could keep asking these questions, and at the end of the day, you could phrase them, you could express them, but there's nothing there.
Yeah, you're right. but this is why some people raise the issue of these have, actually, is it a logical problem? Or is it a semantic problem? Is the paradox of a logical problem? Or is it, when we delve deeper, a matter of sense and reference? Because there is a failure of reference here. So the paradox of the stone, for example, presupposes that the existence of an object, the stone, that inherently contains a contradiction. It's a stone too heavy for a being that could do anything to lift. So the objection argues that since an omnipotent being by definition can lift anything, the concept of a stone that is unliftable by such a being is inherently contradictory and thus nonsensical. Absolutely. So can language pick it out? there seems to be a failure of reference here. There's nothing behind the word. There's nothing behind the terms. So, yeah, is it a meaningless? So this can be framed, and some ulama go down the route to say, actually, this is a failure of language, a failure of reference. There's nothing to which this proposition refers to. It's meaningless. So, I mean, this is the Aristotelian sort of criterion where, a statement to be meaningful, its terms must successfully refer to something real and conceivable. There can't be a reference to a contradiction, i.e. a no thing. You see? So because a stone that is unliftable, so heavy for an omnipotent being to lift, because that is an impossible object, the statements about it are inherently flawed. Does that make sense?
Clear.
Yeah. So you could. I didn't want to miss out the language part, because some people might say, "Oh, but there's a linguistic problem here," and absolutely correct. So yeah, the other thing I want to mention about that was, some people say that, look, there is a failure of sense here. These kind of paradoxes fall flat on their bottom. Why? They fall flat on their bottom. Why? Well, the paradox uses terms and concepts, creates a stone too heavy to be lifted in a way that is not meaningful or applicable in a meaningful way in the context of a divine being and a divine being's action. We're trying to use human terms in human language to describe a state or a reality outside of human experience and understanding. So we're trying to construe a paradox around concepts that we can't really fully understand. What do we mean by a divine creative act? What do we mean by, Allah, in his attributes, because we can't really comprehend them. So when we're constructing these paradox, we're really doing it in dialectically unsound way. We're trying to draw conclusions about something which is we can't adequately comprehend. So how can we construct paradoxes about things where we can't stand in a proper proportionate dialectical engagement with? Can you see? Because God is beyond our comprehension. We can't fathom him. So how can we start making meaningful dialectical claims about his power and action? Does that make sense as well?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So this is the omnipotence paradox of the omnipotence, sort of how ulama have responded to it. Do you want to say something on that? Or
No. Barakallah.
Cool.
Move on.
All right, so we're getting on to one which is probably one of the most thorniest, and that is the paradox of omniscience and freedom. So here, this could fall into a type 3 paradox, i.e. it could relate to divine attribute and how we experience the world, or it could fall under type 1 paradox. It doesn't really matter, i.e. we're looking at one attribute. I want to get too hung up about how to categorize them. I just gave them as a kind of conceptual sort of mapping for anyone who likes typologies and categories. So let's look at this paradox. And I think this is the one that most people talk about at length. I definitely find this one the most talked about in the classroom with students. So here is the problem. And look, I'm not going to deny this. Our ulama talked about this at length. If this is one of the most defining discussions in our theological history, without a doubt. I think, the actions, human, creaturely free actions, and Allah's power and knowledge. Okay, so here's a way to set up the paradox. Okay, divine omniscience, i.e. divine knowledge, particularly foreknowledge, knowing something before it happens, appears to pose a problem for human free will or free actions. If God knows in advance how we will act, it implies that we cannot act freely because we cannot act other than in accordance with what God foreknows. We can't act according to what Allah already knows. This is how the ulama put it. We can't make his knowledge incorrect. It is a theological version, I think, anyway, of fatalism. Fatalism is a thesis that human acts occur by necessity and hence are unfree. Thus, if there is a being who has infallible foreknowledge, knows everything that anyone will do before they do it and can never get it wrong, then this foreknowledge makes our acts necessary. That's the key point here. We must do what this being already knows. We must do. His knowledge makes our acts necessary. That's the problem set up in a simple way. Right, let's have a look at it. Now, me personally, I don't see this as a problem once we see the logic behind it. I really don't. So I'm going to try and sketch that out for our viewers to see, if they get what I get. Maybe I'm missing a trick or something. Remember, there are lots of different versions. Here's one, and I will go through some other responses ulama gave, and we can find in the Islamic tradition as well. Let's take an example. Allah Azza wa Jal knows that I will travel for Hajj, let's say tomorrow. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. I hope Allah invites me to do Hajj again. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. So Allah knows I will travel to do Hajj tomorrow. Premise one. It is not possible to have both Allah knowing that I travel to Hajj tomorrow and I not do it. Why? Because I have to do what Allah knows, right? Now, if Allah knows I will travel to do Hajj tomorrow, whenever it is next week, then it is necessary. It must be the case that I do it. Now, I've highlighted the premise 3 in red, and I want to focus on that premise. Therefore, the conclusion is it is necessary. I must travel to Hajj. So look at premise 1, look at the conclusion. Allah knows I will travel to do Hajj. Therefore, I must travel to do Hajj. That's the conclusion from the first premise and the two premises in between. Now, there's a slight trick going on here. It says, I will do what Allah Azza wa Jal knows. That is for sure, of course. The question is, does Allah knowing beforehand what I do make it logically necessary that I must do that act? I.e., there is no possible way that I do otherwise. And logicians say, no, that commits a modal fallacy. The modal fallacy is this. I cannot, just because something is true about my behavior in the future, just because something is true about my behavior in the future, i.e. traveling to Hajj, it does not make that future behavior that I'm going to do, that traveling to Hajj, unavoidable. It doesn't make it necessary. What I choose to do, there could be any possible outcomes where I don't end up traveling to Hajj. For example, I may wake up late. I got stuck on the traffic. My ticket got cancelled. I lost my ticket. It just wasn't to be. I got lost on the way. All these things are possible. But what this argument is saying is, no, what is known that will happen has to happen. There is no other way that it can be. And this is a modal fallacy. This is the modal fallacy of scope. I cannot infer that something must be the case and I have no other option. I have no other way to do otherwise, just because someone knows before that I'm going to do it. So if Allah knows that I'll travel to Hajj, then it must be, i.e., it is impossible that I do otherwise. But that's clearly fallacious. It is possible that I do otherwise. I've just given you lots of possible examples. I may have got up late. My alarm clock may have not went off. I may have lost my way. The taxi came late. I lost my ticket. I lost my passport. I delayed my flight to do Hajj, to arrive on a different day. Can you see? So the fallacy is when you think just because something is known about a future act, that doesn't compel, doesn't make it logically necessary that that act must be the case. It cannot be otherwise.
So
And that's
basically,
the fallacy.
you're saying God's foreknowledge is not the cause of your
It
action.
doesn't compel you to do. It's factive. I will know what I will do what God knows, of course, but the knowledge doesn't make it logically necessary that I must do it
Mhm.
because
You
it's
know,
logically possible that I do otherwise.
another thing, Akhi Saf, is that sometimes, I mean, looking at how premise three is worded
Mm.
makes it sound like God's foreknowledge is
He's
the
making me.
cause, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I could easily reword it to say, if I am going for Hajj, then it is necessary that God already knows.
But
It,
that's not a problem though.
and that's not a problem, right? So here it's a matter of how it's being worded, because what I just said right now is really communicating the same essential point. Um,
But
but
it's not committing a fallacy. You're
mm,
saying necessarily Allah knows that I'm going to travel. That's a fact.
yeah,
Of
yeah,
course he does. He necessarily knows it. He
mm,
doesn't accidentally, he knows it.
mm,
But
mm.
that's different from saying, um, if Allah knows I'm going to Hajj, then
And
it
it's
is
necessarily the
necessary I must go. And this is where we call the box being misplaced, where you put the box. Because necessarily, God knows that I'm going to go to Hajj tomorrow. That is correct. That's not a fallacy. That's absolutely correct. But to then move the box and say, it is now necessary that I must go to Hajj because God knows, that's fallacious. That's fallacious. And this is where, when people see the logic of it, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Um, it's true. Just because Allah necessarily knows what I'm going to do. Of course, He necessarily knows, but Him necessarily knowing it doesn't make it necessary. It doesn't make it that I must go to Hajj. Can you see? So this is known as the modal scope fallacy. You're putting the necessary in the wrong place. The necessary should come for the whole sentence, not for the consequent, not for the then part of the sentence. So if you see the hook, the horseshoe, the hook, that's the consequent. After that is a consequent part. That's where the box is. That's what makes it commit a fallacy. But if I were to put the box right at the beginning of the sentence and say necessarily, if God knows I will travel to Hajj, then I will travel to Hajj. This is almost like a tautology. It's like, yeah, of course.
yeah.
But when I say, if God knows I will travel, then I must travel. It is logically impossible that I not travel. This is fallacious. Because quite clearly, it is possible that I act otherwise. I may not go to Hajj. Me traveling to Hajj is a contingent act. It's not a necessary act. Unless someone wants to say going to Hajj is a logically necessary act. I don't think anyone wants to say that. Not going to Hajj, saying the statement, not going to Hajj is not a logical contradiction, is it? It's not.
Yeah.
So this is the issue with the divine foreknowledge problem. You're trying to make God's knowledge make it logically necessary that you have to do the act that you have to do. He necessarily knows you're going to do it. He necessarily knows that, of course. But he's necessarily knowing it doesn't mean you necessarily do it. And that's the most simple way I can see um, to show the logical flaw, the ilal, you could say, in the reasoning. And that's you put the box in the wrong place. You put the necessary operator in the wrong place. You could put it at the beginning of the sentence, but you can't put it in the consequent. Um, so if I give it, I don't know, let me think of another, if you don't like the Hajj example, you can replace traveling to Hajj with any act, waking up tomorrow. If God knows I will wake up tomorrow in the morning, then it is not possible that God know that I wake up tomorrow and I fail to do it, of course, because God knows I know I'm going to do what God knows.
Yeah.
But if God knows I want to wake up tomorrow, then I cannot avoid waking up tomorrow. Does that make sense? No. I may not wake up tomorrow. I may, like I may pass away. I may wake up late. I may not wake up the time I'm supposed to wake up. Whatever it might be. So replace traveling to Hajj with any act, and you see the argument is fallacious. It's fallacious. So that's one example you find the ulama gave. In fact, you find this actually in Al-Farabi as well. This modal scope, this shift in the modal operator. But other examples that ulama gave, the other response is that Allah's ilm is very descriptive. It's wasfi, but it doesn't make me do things.
Mm.
It's a bit like a I don't know if you have like bulletins in schools or colleges where where you are. A bulletin says what's going to happen in the week, a weekly bulletin. But does the weekly bulletin make the people do the things that's written on the bulletin?
No.
No. It's a description of what is planned in the week, what will happen. It doesn't make anyone go on. So if in the bulletin it says a group of students will be traveling on Thursday. So bulletin is released on Monday. They'll be traveling on Thursday to the museum. Does the bulletin make the students travel to the museum? No. Similarly, Allah's ilm doesn't compel people to do that. That is one.
Exactly. It's just that God's foreknowledge is so powerful. It's so
It's infallible
to the point that he already flawlessly knows what you will freely and contingently and unnecessarily do in the future.
Yes.
And I think that's the point. And I remember we, in one of our previous sessions, Saf, I gave the example of one philosopher that, try to think of an infallible weather forecaster. Right?
Yeah.
So, the weather forecaster, if he predicts, imagine an infallible weather forecaster. He will predict that the rain will fall tomorrow. But just because he forecasted it, that doesn't mean that he is the cause. His
of it.
forecast, his act of forecasting is the cause of the rainfall, right?
No.
So it's not the cause. It's merely describing what will happen. Likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing in advance what your free-willed action will be does not make it the fact that your action was directly caused and necessary by that foreknowledge.
Yeah.
And it's important for people to understand that because, we don't want to fall into this fatalistic idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We've got to be clear about that. And the reason why I'm sort of, again, like I'm trying to simplify, we can complicate logic as well. We can make it more extended. But what I'm saying is that I want people just to know and reflect on logical flaw in the reasoning. Because I said at the beginning, remember, paradoxes seem like good arguments and they're compelling. But when you pinpoint the flaw, you realize that, actually, that's where it slips up. That's where the argument sort of now goes downhill. We need to identify where those mistakes are. Now, some other responses you'll find within our literature, and I didn't want to not mention them because people may say, well, how about this response? And here are some of them. So we mentioned that Allah's ilm is not causative, and we mentioned that, even though it's infallibly descriptive. Some people say Allah's knowledge is timeless because he's timeless. And so if he timelessly knows what I'm going to do in time, then his knowledge doesn't interfere with what's in time because he timelessly knows everything. Some people, have given that response. Now, some people say, and I think I like this view, to be honest, right? I like the fact that I know from my reality, I freely do things. I don't feel any inner compulsion. I don't feel any external compulsion when I go about doing my day-to-day actions. I do them and I genuinely choose to do them. Now, for me, relates to my action. In a sense, I kind of find it irrelevant because this is something that I can't know about anyway. I can't access. Can you see? So as far as I know, I act freely and I know that Allah is going to judge me on whether I was able to act freely in a particular situation or not. My sphere of acting freely is very limited. It's very limited, but in the limited sphere that I can act, I know that I do it, and I will be judged for that. Do I act according to the Sharia or do I not act according to the Sharia? I have that ability within a limited scope. Now, how Allah knows and what is nature of His knowledge, and that we may not know. So, in a sense, I like that one. I mean, I think let's genuinely look at, are you free when you do things? And I think hand on heart, people will say, yeah, I freely did this. I freely married someone, or I freely went to school, or I freely bought this from the shop. I freely woke up and brushed my teeth, or I freely did this. And people deep down know, like Imam al-Maturidi said, we deep down we know that there is a ability for us to do something without psychological compulsion. Some other people say, look, Allah knows exactly what I'm going to do. He does. He's that infallible barometer that you mentioned, to use your example. But and yet we are free. How I try and understand both, and that's I put the shrug emoji there. I don't know, and it's not going to bother me. I'm just going to get on. I don't know. It's a fact that I can never know. I'm going to leave it. You find ulama inclined to that as well. It's a mystery. It's a sir, and we leave it, isn't it? Some ulama use that language. Some, I don't remember whether the Sunni ulama used this, but Imam al-Ash'ari mentions a view in the Maqalat that future contingent acts are not knowable things. They're not from the class or jins al-ma'lumat. They're not from the ma'lumat. So,
talking about knowledge of particulars here, or is this something else?
no, of anything, yeah, anything that happens. This is not a Sunni position, by the way, but it's recorded. So Allah knows everything except things that are not knowable. Just like Allah can do everything except things that are not doable. It's like the analogy with that. But this has all sorts of implications, and but I just thought I'd put it there. This is not the view that ulama ever took anyway.
Yeah, I mean, unlike with the omnipotence paradox, I mean,
Yeah,
there's clear nusus in the Quran and Sunnah that
absolutely, exactly. So this is why. Subhanallah. So hopefully that's the sort of outline of the omniscience paradox. One more then we're going to look at is sort of the type two of two attributes and how can they cohere. And this is an example that I'll be giving today is the paradox of omnipotence and impeccability, i.e. divine power and moral goodness and perfection. Now I'm calling it, from borrowing from the literature, the problem of fit, i.e. this is the philosophical issue of how it is that omnipotence fits with the attribute of divine perfection, moral perfection. And so we're talking about divine power and divine impeccability, i.e. the belief that Allah Azza wa Jalla is incapable of doing anything that is considered to be naqs, a flaw, a defect, a imperfection. So in the Islamic context, one of the debates that could be described as falling under this problem of fit is whether it is within the divine power to say untruths, i.e. lying. And this is the mas'ala of nisbatu imkan al-kadhib ila Allah Azza wa Jal. This is the mas'ala of attributing untruth to Allah Azza wa Jal. And so
this is a pretty hot topic in the
yeah.
subcontinent.
But the ulama discussed it prior as well, even with regards to mu'jizat. You're right, but within the subcontinent, we have there's a khatt al-ahmar for some on this issue.
A red line, yeah.
Yeah, red line for this whichever way you stand on the line, it could SF, and this is one of the things that I find regrettable within our theology, where masail like daqiqa, really intricate masail that I don't even like talking about in public. These things ought not to be matters that divide,
Yeah,
uh, uh,
yeah, yeah.
and
Uh,
so it gets to.
and you did publish an article, a very well researched article on this recently, called "God, Logic, and Lies:
Oh yeah,
Intra-Hanafi
yeah.
Polemics on Divine Omnipotence in Colonial India." Maybe if you could also touch upon that a little briefly, maybe after you go through this argument, that would also be educational.
Yeah, I'll try and do that, inshallah.
Great. So
Let's
let's see
okay.
what this argument is about. And
Okay, so this argument goes something like this. And so I've kind of framed it in the following way. Again, people can dispute the framing, and I'm just putting it here. So I want to get to be behind the logic of it as well. Okay, so an argument, the problem can be constructed like this. So God is both omnipotent and morally perfect. He's holy, he's good, he's all these attributes of beauty and perfection. So he's both powerful and morally perfect. If God is omnipotent, then he's able to construct an untruth, a lie, right? If God is morally perfect, then he cannot lie. Therefore, God can and cannot tell a lie. Can you see? So if he has the power to tell a lie, then he can actualize it in principle. That's something doable. But if he's morally perfect, he can't do it.
mm,
So now we've got a tension. His power says he can do it, but his moral perfection says he can't do it. So now we've got a tension. Um, and that tension is a contradiction because we cannot have a contradiction. The upside down T is a symbol for contradiction. So the crux of the argument, as I see it in my framing of it, is the interaction between premise 2 and 3. And that is, believe it or not, where the interaction in the books of the scholars, that's where the interaction was mainly. There's an apparent contradiction between omnipotence, the ability to do anything, and in this instance, the ability to be able to say, to construct a proposition that is false, and moral perfection, the inability of Allah Azza wa Jal to commit any immoral act, a qubh, a fact, any fawahis, all these kind of things, billah. So these kind of things, yeah? So what's the issue then? How do ulama go about addressing this issue? Let me try and break down some examples. So that's the argument there. The problem is between premise 2 and 3. If God is omnipotent, then he is able to lie, say an untruth. If God is morally perfect, he cannot lie because lying is a defect and other things like that. So now we've got he can lie and he can't lie. What do we do? Right, let's look at to see how ulama address this issue. Now, there's clearly two broad positions you can take. One, you say it's within the scope of divine power to do some act phi or ipsilon. Phi or epsilon. These are phi and epsilon are just immoral acts. I don't want to name them and associate Allah Azza wa Jalla's name with them. So I just put them as symbols. So think of any morally imperfect act. That's what phi and epsilon means. So either you accept it's within divine power, and then you put some qualifications, or you flat outright and say it's not within divine power to do these acts. So let me go through each one. So as I see it in the literature, if you're going to say yes, it is within divine power to Allah to say an untruth, i.e. premise 2, God is omnipotent, then he's able to lie, i.e. you embrace that as true. You straight away, you put some constraints. Every ulama put constraints. They qualified it. Some of them said it is within his power to do that, to say an untruth, to lie, but it is something he will never, in fact, do. He'll never actualize it. So it's an unactualized possibility. Does that make sense? It will never
yeah,
be actualized. The lie will never be actualized, but is it potentially there? Yes. Why? Because to put together a statement that is false is something within the realms of what is possible in itself. Can you see? If you and I can do it and it's possible, there's no contradiction in affirming, putting together a sentence that is untrue, constructing a proposition that is untrue.
Okay,
The act
but
itself is not
if I
impossible.
were to ask these scholars
Yeah.
who say that it is possible, but he will never do it,
Yes.
what is the basis of them saying Allah will never do it? Are they trying to say that
Well,
Allah
this one,
being
yeah.
all truthful is contingent upon His will, or will they deny that Allah's attribute of being all truthful is necessary?
Well, on this one, it is not something he will ever, in fact, do.
Hmm.
It's not every possibility is necessarily actualizable, right? It's just this view just says it's merely logically possible. It's within the realms of um, a possibility. Whether it gets whether so we got to move from it being mumkin to whether it actually occurs, what they call wuku'. Yeah, we're not talking about whether it actually occurs, but is it something just possible?
Hmm.
Is it in the realms of imkaniyat? That's all. Just on the abstract level, is it something within that's logically possible? Yes, it's within the
Yeah.
realm
So
of
yeah,
possibility.
we're not talking about a squared circle here, right?
No, no, we're
So
not. We're not.
we're
No,
talking about
no.
uttering an untruth. So
Yes,
that's something conceptually imaginable.
possible. Yeah, yeah,
Uh
yeah. So intrinsically, it's not impossible, like a contradiction, like a
huh.
square circle,
Uh huh.
or like a omnipotence paradox we talked
But
about.
would they say it's extrinsically impossible in light of Allah's other attribute of all?
Well, that's what we're going to come to for the
Okay.
next one. The
Okay.
first view just says we're just going to accept it being
Mm.
within the realm of pure possibility.
Okay. Okay.
But it's up to Allah whether He wants to actualize certain things that are possible or not.
Uh-huh.
We're just going to leave it at the realm of the abstract.
Okay.
The next view goes a bit one step further, adds a further qualification. It is within God's power to tell that untruth, that lie, but it is something He would never desire to do. That's the constraint. Allah has no irada for it. There's no irada for Him to say an untruth. And they get that from nas and they get that from aql, from reason.
Yeah.
So
فَعَالٌ
there's
لِمَا
no,
يُرِيدُ. Yeah.
yeah. So Allah just has there's no desire for Him. He has no, there's nothing that, He has within Himself that just desires Him to bring about an untruth. So the desire is the constraint to His power. He has the power, but it's not a desire that He ever has. Just like, I'm not comparing Allah to creation.
Okay.
I'm just saying, like, sometimes we just don't have an appetite. We just don't want to do it. We don't have a desire ever.
Yeah.
We don't have an inclination to do certain things. So that's one qualification, you could say. Another is it is within Allah's power, but it is not something that Allah's wisdom, His hikmah, will allow Him to actualize. So the hikmah is the additional constraint here to the power.
Would you say opinion number three is probably more within Maturidi circles?
Yeah, you find that definitely. Yeah, that it's not. There's no hikmah in what possible wisdom is there in Allah Azza wa Jal doing this particular act.
mm, mm.
Nothing in the hikmah that He's described about the nature of hikmah attributed to Himself will say He will do that kind of act. Just like nothing in His will, His irada Jalla wa ala, that He has explained about His own will and desires, tells us that He would want to do something like this. Number four, it is something that Allah voluntarily restrains Himself doing.
I know there's a limitation in language here, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So Allah chooses for Himself not to do it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He can do it on this view, but He just
Chooses not to.
decided, yeah, I want to impose limits on myself. Well, I don't want to use that, but
Yeah.
restraint on myself.
Mm.
And there is textual example of this, that Allah imposing on Him Rahman Himself, كتب على نفسي الرحمة. I put نفسي الرحمة on myself as a guiding sort of restraint on myself. So that kind of concept is there of the divine self-restraint.
Do you feel there's overlap between points 1, 2, and 4?
Yes, there is. Yes. Yes, there is. But I'm saying when you see it, some people add the qualification that though Allah has the power to do something, it remains in the realm of possibility. Mumkinat. It never becomes actual. Others say, although Allah has the power to do it, it's something He will never desire to do. So His desire constrains His power. Although He has the power to do it, His wisdom just will never allow it. So His wisdom constrains His power. Similarly, he just has decided that he's going to put some limitations on what he does on himself. He's allowed to do whatever he wants for himself. If he wants to reveal to creation, he's put a limit on himself here, then so be it. That's up to him. That's out of his choice. And each of these, I believe, can, or several views within the tradition. And in the handout, I put quotes where people can go to. Now, the view that says it's not within the scope of divine power to do such things, their main argument is it is not in Allah's nature would never and cannot allow him to do these acts. His nature cannot allow him to do these acts. So it becomes muhal, it becomes impossible because of his divine nature. You and I can do it, but his nature wouldn't allow him to do it. Just like his nature, he can't act according to against his own nature. Like he suddenly cannot become finite. He suddenly cannot become uncaused. He suddenly cannot become a contingent being. He suddenly cannot become non-existent. He cannot suddenly lose an attribute. He suddenly cannot, and so it is not. It's not a limitation on Allah Azza wa Jal that he can't act according to his nature. Rather, it's a perfection that his nature is upheld. His nature is upheld.
And the other camp the other camp would see this as maybe some kind of compromise of some sorts on God's omnipotence, and therefore, so one side wants to
maintain
to not compromise in some way or another on God's omnipotence. While the other side does not want to compromise on God's, truth. And obviously both sides are coming from a good place here, and
absolutely,
it's just that they're both reaching the same conclusion at the end.
They are.
But I think one argument that I've seen from the camp that states that it is intrinsically impossible in light of Allah's nature, the other camp is, well, if you don't believe that it is intrinsically and necessarily impossible for Allah to utter a lie, then how could you ever know whether he is how do you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not because obviously a kafir will come and probably and a lot of missionaries do tend to give sort of arguments. Oh, you believe your God could deceive, so how do you know he's not deceiving you, etc. Little cheap arguments. But I think the other camp, they're not stooping down to that level, but they're trying to give similar in the sense that you're opening your conception of God to critique if you do not affirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is necessarily intrinsically.
Absolutely. I mean, look, all these arguments and some novel ones were brought together in a book written by Ahmad Rida Khan called Subhan al-Subuh عن عيب كذب المقبوح and Al-Qam' al-Mubin. It was another text. He brings a lot of the aqwal of the ulama, and Imam al-Juwayni mentions this argument you mentioned there, that imagine now you say there's a possibility, just a possibility, remember, a mere abstractor, that this can that can ensue from the divine. well, now this will lead to insurmountable problems in da'wah now, because um, people will criticize Islam and say, look, no matter how much you try and defend your doctrine, I have doubts and I have questions over whether the Quran, the veracity of the Quran, or the veracity of your Prophet, because of the mere possibility, just the mere possibility um, of there may be a doubt in it because of the mere logical possibility of it. You see, and then they will doubt the very foundations of the doctrines of Islam. So it becomes now something insurmountable in da'wah. Someone could turn around and say to you, well, I don't, how do I know this is not come from an untruthful source? What, do you want to go down the logical argument of, logically possible, and then, can you see, you're a bit stuck now. So you're right about that, Bassam. That's true. And there are many, many arguments Ahmad Khan brings in there. I think about 30 dalil he brings, or indications why. 30, or don't quote me off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly, but at least 30 arguments why it's not within the divine scope of omnipotence to bring about morally imperfect actions, because it's contrary to divine nature. And one of the ones is the ones you just mentioned. He also mentioned many, many other ones, and so, um, you know,
But here, going back to the question of
yeah,
because his nature will not permit it, right? Um,
even though
but,
something to you and I might be logically possible. So their
mm,
argument is this: something in and of itself might just, as a proposition, not be formally contradictory, right?
mm,
Just,
mm,
but, but because we're talking about the nature of the divine, we now have to see, has the divine mentioned about certain things that he cannot do? Even though you and I, propositionally, it doesn't sound logically impossible.
mm,
لا تأخذ سنة ولا نوم. Can you see?
mm, mm.
Now, sleeping just by itself as a proposition is not logically contradictory, is it?
Yeah,
A being X that sleeps, or a being X that gets tired. That doesn't sound logically contradictory.
yeah,
So therefore it must be actualizable. But when we go to the scripture, Allah Azza wa Jal says, he can't take a son, or he never sleeps, or slumber doesn't overtake him. He's one, and so on and so on.
yeah. Yeah,
Unless,
but
yeah,
because I've really tried to think about this, and mashallah, I haven't dived as deeply as you have in this, but I did write a short blog article on
yeah,
this topic, and I
you
really
did.
did try to think about it because essentially, look at point 3 that you mentioned here. It
Yeah,
is not something that his wisdom will allow. Now, I could frame that position as basically saying that because obviously wisdom here is still referring to God's nature of divine
yes,
wisdom,
yes,
and one could still describe this position as saying
yes,
that God will never lie given his nature. Like both sides could come and say we both believe that God will never lie in light of his nature, but
yeah,
one
yeah,
one side might be thinking more of a particular attribute than the other. There,
yes,
one side might be having who one their basis for the impossibility will
yeah,
be different from the basis of the other side when they say it's impossible, right? Um, and so when that side is saying it's within God's scope of power, uh, again, it seems to me that they're trying to say, look, it's not an intrinsically absurd idea like a squared circle or a married bachelor.
yeah.
However, we still believe it's impossible for other reasons in light of his divine wisdom. Now,
Yeah, this is
obviously,
the this
that
is
doesn't
the
cover
problem of
all the
extremism.
positions.
Yeah,
It
extremism.
doesn't cover all the positions like number 4 there,
Yeah.
but that's always been my understanding when I see like the Deobandi side, for example, that they will
Ah,
still say it's impossible, but not for the same reasons that the other side would argue, unless I've misunderstood. But
no,
um,
no, you're right. It depends what constraint you use
yes,
for divine power. Are you bringing in wisdom? Are
mm,
you bringing desire? Are you bringing in? You can bring in some other attribute internal to Allah to constrain it. Now, unless you want to say Allah wouldn't do this act because of some criterion that you bring, external criterion, beyond him, in virtue of which he wouldn't do that act. You can't go outside of Allah to bring a criterion, right?
Mm, mm.
Unless you want to. Unless you want to say there's some absolute moral standard beyond Allah Azza wa Jal, in virtue of which he doesn't lie. Can you see? That's the problem of using extrinsic metric. But no ulama wants to go and say beyond Allah is the standard he refers to. That's why he doesn't do it. You see, they're trying to look for constraints from within the divine attributes themselves. What other attribute will put a constraint on the divine? The divine power here, the divine power. So he could do it. And the reason why it would never come about is because of some other attribute of his, not some external criterion.
Yeah.
Now, what you take that internal attribute to be now, his wisdom, his will, his desire, or whatever other quality you want to bring. But the second camp, who says it's not within the scope of divine power, full stop, for them the entailments are too serious. So it makes it impossible. Yeah. Not impossible because of some constraint like desire, hikmah, impossible full stop. You see?
Yeah.
Now it's true, the second camp, the camp that says it's not within the scope of divine power, often say the first view, the view that allows it within God's possible, God's power, within the mumkinat, their view is no different from Ibn Hazm's view. So once you open the door to allow a possibility, you can't close it. So Ibn Hazm's view was, that if Allah Azza wa Jal wants, he can do anything he wants, even the absurd. But why doesn't he do it? Ibn Hazm says in the Muhalla, Al-Milal, he says, it's because this is not a world. There are many worlds that Allah can do it. He used that term, many worlds. But in this one, his wisdom, he just decided not to do it out of his wisdom. So what has Ibn Hazm done? He said in this world and not other possible worlds, in the actual world, Allah's exercised his wisdom not to allow that to be something possible. But in another world, he could break the laws of logic and contravene his own nature. So the question is that a fair criticism? Can you see, is that a fair criticism? What will be the substantive difference in terms of modal logic between the view of Ibn Hazm and this view? I'm not putting either way. But what if one wanted to navigate this, just to give some underpinning, if someone wanted to navigate this sort of difference of understanding, what criterion of tarjih could you use? Right? You're going to have you might use a on preference, which one do you think is more, ought to be preferred? You need some qara'in. And because it's a matter to do with Allah's nature, we'll have to go to scripture to see what on balance will be better. Is it that it's more fitting to say he has the power, but he has imposed a constraint on himself, whether that's using he voluntarily does it through his will, or his desire, or his wisdom, or the fact that he's just something that he may just not actualize. It's up to him. Is that better reflective of the nusus? Or is the second position more reflective of the nusus? That Allah tells us there's certain things by his nature he cannot do. Not because of a limitation on his nature, but that's more of his perfection. It's part of his perfection that he cannot take a child, a son. Isn't it? It's part of his perfection that he's not overtaken by slumber, and so on and so on and so on. These aren't limitations. Even though you and I can, right? Even though you and I can take children if Allah allows us, or you and I, we can sleep, you and I, we can get tired. It doesn't mean our power is greater than the power of Allah Azza wa Jal.
No, I mean, I like the way you put it at the end, right? Which is that, the way, some of these critics try to frame these arguments, and they're trying to instill into our minds that these are limits. No, on
Yeah,
the contrary, these are not
on the
limits.
contrary,
These are perfections. We're
absolutely.
we're these are we're absolutely glad to know that that these things are not applicable to God.
But that's by Allah just describing it about himself, right? By his own nature. Um, Otherwise, for me, there's going to be these differences because historically there's these differences, and you can see rationally how these differences play out, right? You can think, you can see how ulama have contemplated about this, and they've come to these divergent conclusions. It just happened to be the diversion, is very polemical. It's based on a context of polemics. But my opinion is these polemics, when polemics become explosive, when they become flare-ups, they happen more not because of the theology, but more about contestations of authority, about heterodoxy and orthodoxy,
Mm.
within a broader framework of contestations about authority. I haven't got any evidence. I haven't done research on this. I haven't got any substantive evidence, but this is how I sense it to be from the vague reading that I've done. Often these polemics that become explosive are often related to some kind of political issue. The Mihna with Imam Ahmad and Khalq al-Quran, that was the Mu'tazila and power. Here in the subcontinent, I feel these contestations about who's right when it comes to this issue is in a broader vision of how Muslim authority would look like in India. Allah knows best. Allah knows best. Oh, sorry, I didn't. Maybe I interrupted you, Bassam.
No, 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 not at all.
I, I mean, if you permit me, I wanted to just mention some concluding remarks
Absolutely.
about this. Look, I mean, for me, here are just some of my thoughts. There are many more that I'm sure I can add, but just a few, and I think is worth mentioning. Theological paradoxes, we're going to expect them, or we're going to expect things may not make sense. Why? Because we're trying to combine human creaturely finite mind and Allah Azza wa Jal. That's in effect what we're trying to do, bridge that our creator with our finite minds. And inevitably when we try and do that, we're going to we're going to bump our heads. We're going to bump our heads. And things aren't going to make sense. And that's just the limitation of the aql. We're trying to make judgments beyond things which the aql can reach and things like that. So that's the first thing I think people ought to bear in mind. And that's not a problem. That's not a problem. We need to know where the place of the aql is, the majal of the aql, and where it's not. Secondly, theological paradoxes don't entail the non-existence of God. That's just absurd. It's fallacious to think that. Why? Because the existence of God is proven through independent arguments. So someone says, you haven't solved the omnipotence, the impeccability paradox, therefore God doesn't exist. It's silly. No one should feel Allah's existence is in doubt because I can't explain a matter to do with modality, possibility, and necessity. Rather, Allah's existence is established definitively through other proofs. So we shouldn't equate that I can't work out some paradox, therefore God doesn't exist. It shouldn't have that effect on us. It shouldn't. As I tried to show, and I didn't do it in an absolute detail way. This wasn't a philosophy lecture, lecture in logic, in modal logic, but many theological paradoxes, have logical flaws, have logical problems with them. And so in the end, for me, they're not logical worries at all. We shouldn't worry about them. Once you see the logic, you'll be like, oh, I get that. Oh, yeah, actually, that makes sense. Oh, I see where the problem is now. And it makes sense. And that's it. Your worry just dissipates once you see the logical flaw in these paradoxes. This is maybe more of a sociological point, but I know some people love these paradoxes and they get so enamored and hooked up by them. I see people like that, and they think this is what theology is about. But most people, wallah, this is what I found in my day-to-day interactions. People don't care about these paradoxes. They really don't. Can God create a stone so great that he can't lift it? People are like, what are you on about? Only you and your small group of people are going to be so preoccupied with it. Most people aren't concerned about that when it comes to theological issues. This is what I found personally. But some people find it attractive, and there is a place to address it because it does create shubuhat and it creates doubt. And hopefully, some of the answers we shared from our ulama and our tradition will help in assuaging that kind of niggling, sort of troubling sort of feeling. Lastly, being preoccupied with these sort of abstract theological paradoxes can detract from the power of Iman, the vitality of Iman being a permeating force in our life. Wallahi, I tell you, you mentioned about Palestine at the beginning, Habibi. That is Iman in action. When I see people, when they've just seen the most horrendous thing imaginable, the most horrendous evil happening before their eyes, make taslim to the qada of Allah Azza wa Jal. They surrender to the decree of Allah. That is Iman in action. They have sabr. And I mean sabr, not, oh, I stumped my toe and I stopped myself from expletive. No. Sabr عند صدمة الأولى, at the time when it's the most required. And people accept the decree of Allah Azza wa Jal. And they move on. That is Iman in action. That is Iman lived as a vital force. Not Iman just sort of a mere exercise in abstract reflection and ta'ammul and jidal. I'm not saying these don't have a place, Habibi. I'm not. I really am not. I'm not saying these don't have a place. But what I'm saying is when we see Iman in action as a vital power, that is when we see, subhanallah, that is Iman. The understanding that when they say that the ajal is finished, this was the qada, this was the decree of Allah for the ajal to finish now, and in the way that it finished. Everyone's ajal, Allah's fixed everyone's ajal. He knows who's going to die when and how. We accept it. This was part of Allah's decree, we accept it. And it's a khair. And Allah wanted this for us, this test, and it's a khair. And that's the kind of Iman that I see as a permeating force. Whereas the abstract intellectual, aqli stuff has its place. But this is, I see as being the true power of Iman. And this is how we ought to try and live our life, with that kind of Iman as a permeating force. So I'm not trying to belittle what we've discussed today. I'm not. It has its place. And subhanAllah, you're right. It creates shubuhat and doubts in people's minds. And people get bogged down in sectarian divide. This presentation that I didn't want to inflame any sectarian tensions. I didn't name anyone. It was just, we thought we would have a chat about paradoxes and to show the flaws, the logical flaws in these paradoxes, because it creates some doubt in people's beliefs. So that was my main intention, and that was some of my concluding points. Barakallahu
fikum, Akhi Saf, for your well-argued presentation. And, and once again, this demonstrates that all arguments against our faith have answers to them, alhamdulillah, and this also shows just how important seeking knowledge is if Muslims want to be capable of addressing these kinds of criticisms. Clearly, as you've shown, our scholars have already thought about and tackled these sorts of objections. A student of knowledge ideally would be aware of such scholarly contributions, while an uninformed Muslim layman might find these objections to be too intellectually intimidating and possibly even begin to doubt his faith, God forbid. Therefore, it's important for all of us to remember just how critical it is to study, or at the very least, be able to consult the people of knowledge when being exposed to such arguments. Before we close off, perhaps you could tell us what you're currently working on and what we could expect to see from you in the near future, inshallah ta'ala.
So a few things I'm sort of dabbling in. Some of it is around this topic or that we just concluded on about divine omnipotence and impeccability. You're right, one article had come out on this, that's true, just recently. I hope to complete a trilogy of articles on it, the second one and then the third one,
MashaAllah, wow.
just to bring to the attention, like you said, the way our ulama discussed this in a lot of depth, and to show that the thinking behind there is profound. They thought hard about it, and they came up with amazing responses, novel intellectual responses. So some of that I'm trying to bring out to the fore so people can be acquainted with it. I'm also working on the project monograph on religious epistemology,
Oh, MashaAllah.
particularly the virtue traditions. I'm working on that, and some areas of tasawwuf, which I've got to finish up some articles on, um, especially in the thought of Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami. That's the Sufi who obviously my PhD and my focus was on, and so I'm trying to do that, and I'm also trying to work in the field of ethics, but
Mm,
looking at the intersection between Islamic ethics and this kind of consolation literature like Tasriyat al-Musab. How do we console the grief-stricken?
mm,
Yeah, so I'm looking at ethics and sort of that and the meaning-making tradition in psychology. So sort of dabbling in a few things, and seeing how, inshallah, within the next few months, how they all come together. And of course, I keep you updated on the publications, my academia page. I'll update. And so yeah, those are a few things that I'm
MashaAllah.
doing at the moment.
وفقكم Allah. You know, yeah, you're definitely very
Barakallah.
busy, Saf, and we're
La
always
wallah.
really excited to see what you're going to be publishing next. And
Yeah,
inshallah ta'ala.
barakallah. The exciting thing is the work that you're doing at BT, Blog and Theology, you and the team.
Well, it's only exciting
Fantastic
because
work.
of people like yourself doing the
La
hard
la
work,
wallah,
Saf. You know,
honestly,
our job is easy here. We're just interviewing you guys doing all the hard work.
no,
So,
honestly, it's become
you
a
know,
beacon, I think, and many people look to the channel to see what's next, and it's become like that,
alhamdulillah,
and subhanallah, so leading the conversation in these matters. So
alhamdulillah.
Allah give you and the team tawfiq and give you barakah in the work, and to go from strength to strength. And
Ameen.
it's really been a force of good. It really has.
Ameen.
Um,
Ameen. Barakallahu feek for your kind words. And, you know, we definitely look forward to having you on again. And definitely looking forward to, especially looking forward to your work on epistemology, because that's something I'm really interested in.
inshallah.
With that, I
Shukran.
will conclude and I'll part you and our listeners with the Islamic greetings. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.